Hi, Jasper. Thank you so much for joining us on our Reg Plus Tech podcast. Would you
Yes,
mind doing a quick intro?
sure. So I'm Jasper. Or Jasper Mills. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Ethira. And we are an AI accountability and governance infrastructure company focusing on supply chain specifically. So basically, what that means is we help companies to understand what exists in their systems, who owns it, is it doing what it's supposed to, and is it worth it for me? So we
Movement from the traditional industries that have been operating in the same way for such a long time. Technically, your systems governance, your third party oversight and operational resilience frameworks should in principle manage what you're now building on top of. But the reality is, because it was kind of isolated or not seen as high impact previously, those systems haven't been mapped or governed. And so I think
exactly.
that catch up in certainly in financial services businesses, that catch up, should it be as big of a gap as it is? I don't know. I'm not sure. But there
Mm,
certainly exists. It does exist.
yeah, I would say that that's actually, if you look at sort of like the way that we build this, is like there are ways now with AI actually to that it's been. I mean that the gap that you're describing, I think, has historically been there, and even if they think they've had it in place, it generally like belongs to John in the corner who has like a spreadsheet that he kind of updates occasionally, and like when something goes wrong, like sends a major like SOS. Um, but I would say that I think that this is actually being rewritten now by AI because the ability to do discovery and to do it automatically and to be able to understand like how systems map and how like what the sort of reliance is actually sort of enabled now in a way that it wasn't maybe previously, which would have been a much bigger exercise. So that's actually something that we're seeing, and that's one of the things that obviously we do first. So yeah.
What's your kind of, I guess, original purpose in terms of building this startup? Like, what was your
Mm.
driver? Was the data piece something that you were always interested in? Was it the systems? How have you come to this as a solution?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, so what we basically first started with is that I was running engineering operations at a company called Trustly, like going back to operational resilience. And what we saw actually was like a lack of operational resilience around third party providers. And if you think back, like from a historical perspective, like, fintechs and banks and everything for a long time, until like 2015, like mostly built on site, which meant that like their services were pretty like concentrated. They maintained them. They sort of had everything on site. And gradually, what you've seen sort of over the last 10 years is that structure has really shifted, right, from building on site to having many third parties, which actually have now sort of like function as infrastructure in your systems. And so there was a regulation that came up called the Digital Operational Resilience Act.
Mm-hmm.
And I was in charge of the third party ICT risk part of that for part of the organization. And what I ended up realizing was like there were no actual, I mean, this problem, right? Like that there was very little understanding of how these sort of like core things you did not build integrate into your actual systems. And that's what we were doing. And it took just an enormous amount of time. And at the same time, we are seeing sort of the dawn of AI. And I thought there's better way to both do sort of this data collection, the data management, this cross-functional structure. And then as we started building, what became clearer and clearer is that like your workforce is going to shift from being not people, but it's going to, I mean, it's going to sound dystopian, but a really a digital workforce. And that needs the same sort of like oversight and accountability as you would have with sort of the contractors that you bring into your organization. And that was the worry that we saw from a lot of our customers and the sort of like frameworks that they wanted to have. And so we started building towards that of how do you govern and how do you secure your contracted workforce.
Yeah, and I guess you mentioned regulation. Obviously, DORA is an EU-based regulation. The
Mm,
UK has operational resilience frameworks under the PRA and the FCA, so that there are layers of governance that should, in theory, add or give comfort or give certainty to the way that organizations operate. But with principles-based regulators, that obviously gives that room for interpretation, maneuverability for organizations, and I think perhaps even trade-offs in certain areas which are now not able to necessarily be ignored.
Right, exactly. And I think that what's actually becoming more and more important is like they have these, I mean, at least like in the area that we operate, I think you have the systems which have historically lived in sort of like static states. And the static state is starting to evaporate. And so that's actually where we really see sort of the opportunities coming, is this idea of having like a continuous data stream, a continuous understanding of what's happening, what's changing, and being able to manage that from an operational perspective, right? I think if you look at existing tools on the market, tend to be a lot of alerts without a lot of context. And where you see sort of the market moving is like the ability to actually manage what is happening from an operational resilience like structure in your organization, but then actually be able to close that loop. And so the closed loop sort of structure where you can actually have better oversight without adding a ton more work is sort of the direction in which we see real opportunities, and we think that organizations will benefit from AI the most.
Yeah, and in terms of operational resilience, at least we have some level of consistency of understanding, I think, globally. There is somewhat of a concept for it everywhere. Obviously, the UK, in terms of AI, is taking the approach that they're not going to regulate right now, whereas the EU has the EU AI Act. What's your view on the EU AI Act? Do you think it's necessary? Do you think it goes far enough? Do you think it has sufficient layers of, I guess, definitions even around what the expectations are?
So I think that so actually the EU AI Act I think is paused, but there are some like parts of it. But they're basically I think that it is hard to regulate things that you don't understand. I think that but there are levels of regulation, right? I think the regulation is very complex. I think that ultimately that this will play out. I don't think it's binary, right? I still think you need to have guardrails and safeguards for like society, and I think that that is like something that's really important, and I think that those need to be like well thought out. I think that the technology is actually moving too fast to have like appropriate regulations in place. And not that I think that that's like not what should be in place, and I think that eventually will be in place, but I think generally what you're seeing happen in real time is actually that contracts will become more powerful than regulation because people cannot keep up with, or the regulations can't keep up with the pace of technology. So if you think about like sort of the numerous cyber attacks that are happening, those are being litigated now in court because there's privacy breaches. They're using existing laws to regulate, I guess, or they're using existing laws to basically push liability down to the vendors themselves who are actually reliable. I think it's just a very gray area. Sorry, that was a long-winded way of saying like
Regulation
I have
doesn't
some mixed.
cover everything.
Yeah, exactly. Like it doesn't cover everything, and it's also we're in a unique period that I'm not sure that we don't exactly know what to regulate yet. I think that's the real like problem, is that it's not super clear on like what is actually going to be the most impactful, because we're still unaware of like what are the biggest harms.
I completely agree. And I think in terms of, say, in the UK context, they're kind of pausing and using existing principles to ensure that organizations are effectively just ensuring that customers are getting the best outcomes and monitoring the outcomes, which I think is a good approach. But I guess similarly, for example, in the crypto space, we waited quite a long time to have crypto legislation, then regulation. And it's very kind of similar in a way, because even in the crypto space, we didn't know what to regulate for. And I completely empathize with the FCA's kind of maybe delayed approach to publishing regulation for crypto, whereas I've heard a lot of other compliance or people in my network kind of say the opposite, that, oh, we should have done it sooner. And it's almost like you'll never please everyone, so those principles should be in place first. regardless of any kind of formal regulation or
Yeah,
legislative framework.
I agree. I mean, I think that you can also look at like sort of like the long-term harms that like society also considers, right? If you think about like, at least, I mean, I come from the US, I obviously live in Europe now. But I think that one of the things that is important to think about in these kinds of situations are beyond social media, but I'm sorry, beyond crypto, but are things like social media, right? So in the US, there was virtually no way to regulate this social media and they never really came up with an effective way to do that. And I think that you saw a lot of sort of like societal division, societal harms that ended up happening as a result of like being unable to sort of like regulate even whether teenagers went on or like things around minor and sort of like there were a lot of sort of like child problems that came up around social media that I think ended up being sort of like deeply damaging and caused a lot of problems for the tech industry from just like the level of trust that the companies had, or sorry, that people had in them. And I think that AI like risks having the same outcome without having the like grace period that I think the social media industry had because nothing had come before it. Whereas I think people do look back and they think, oh, what happened with Facebook? Like, is that going to happen again? Where people felt very powerless to do anything.
Yeah, but I think to a greater or lesser extent, the tech industry does have some level of responsibility for what they're producing, because I think what we're seeing now is because of the lower barriers to entry for tech. So you mentioned the coding portion. Now that you don't need to have anyone to test the scalability, the security, you can just sell a product effectively on a demo on Lovable. And there's nothing wrong with doing a demo on Lovable, but it's just you've got to then consider, okay, well, if we do have clients, what is the security and how does it scale, and what is the kind of operations in behind the scenes. So I think the reg tech industry, or the tech industry in general, has got I'm talking about it from a reg tech perspective, but the tech industry does have a lot to answer for, because they've almost given a false assurance to this point around what's going on and behind the scenes. And I think they're the ones almost in the know. But on the flip side, what organizations haven't done is attempted to actually upskill themselves to understand what's going on. And I think there's a real gap now that's emerging between internal organizational understanding of systems, frameworks in general, regardless whether you're effectively outsourcing to a system provider, versus where the tech actually is. So what would you say in terms of practical stuff about training and around things like that for organizations?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like, and again, I still think that this will come back to customer demand. I think it's really hard to educate sort of a generation of new builders on like how they should behave, but when they just like don't really have any idea, like what sort of like level of responsibility do they have. I think that like for more established companies, like there's a lot of sort of like bang the drum about like, customer data and customer this and customer that. But ultimately, I think that customers will demand that these things happen, right? And I think that that's probably more of the forcing function than like companies taking it on like on their own sort of accord to like fix these things, like whether I think that's right or whether I think that's wrong. I think that like financial and highly regulated companies are in a particularly good position to actually like sort of lead some of these sort of best practices, as long as they don't. I think that if they can come up with an effective way to adopt like really sort of like highly effective tooling, like they actually are on the sort of forefront of how this can look, because like they have the tooling, they understand like how to manage sensitive and personal data, they understand like the risks involved, they have the frameworks I think available. Like if they can just adapt those frameworks to something that's like less point in time and more continuous, I really think that there's an opportunity to provide a model of what good can look like.
Yeah,